21 hours. That is how long the United States and Iran sat across a table from each other in Islamabad, Pakistan, in the highest level face-to-face meeting between the two countries in decades. 21 hours. And they walked away with nothing. Vice President J.D. Vance stepped out of that building, boarded Air Force Two, and told reporters that Iran had chosen not to accept American terms. A few hours later, Donald Trump opened Truth Social and typed words that in any other era of history would have been the opening shot of a world war. Effective immediately, the United States Navy, the finest in the world, will begin the process of blockading any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz. One word: blockade. And every oil market on the planet started moving. Today, we are not going to talk about headlines. We are going to talk about physics, logistics, money, and history. Because behind that single word is a chain of consequences that is already changing the price you pay for fuel, for food, and for everything that gets transported on a truck, a ship, or a plane, anywhere on Earth, including where you live right now. Let's start with the geography, because most people have no idea what the Strait of Hormuz actually is in physical terms. It is a narrow channel of water, just 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, sitting between Iran on one side and Oman on the other. It connects the Persian Gulf to the open ocean, and through that 34-kilometer bottleneck flows approximately 20 million barrels of oil every single day. That number, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, represents about 20% of all petroleum liquids consumed on the entire planet. In terms of maritime trade specifically, it accounts for roughly 25% of all seaborne oil shipments worldwide. And it is not just oil. Around 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas trade also passes through this corridor. Almost all of it comes from Qatar, the world's second largest LNG exporter. And there are no alternative routes for Qatar's gas. None. If the strait is closed, that gas simply does not move. Now think about who depends on all of this. According to the EIA, approximately 84% of the crude oil and condensate moving through the strait was destined for Asian markets in 2024. China alone receives over a third of its entire oil supply through this single choke point. India, Japan, and South Korea are close behind. In total, China, India, Japan, and South Korea together account for nearly 70% of all oil flowing through the strait. And the Persian Gulf is also the world's largest hub for fertilizer production. The region accounts for roughly 30 to 35% of global urea exports and around 20 to 30% of ammonia exports. Overall, up to 30% of all internationally traded fertilizers normally transit the Strait of Hormuz. So, a farmer in Illinois, a farmer in Kansas, a farmer in Central Europe who is pricing his inputs for the next growing season, he is already paying the cost of this crisis, not metaphorically, literally, in the price of the bag he buys at his local agricultural supplier. Now let's ask the obvious question. Can the world simply go around? What are the alternative routes? The IEA estimates that only Saudi Arabia and the UAE have operational pipelines capable of bypassing the strait, with a combined available spare capacity of approximately 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day. That sounds significant until you remember that before the war, 20 million barrels per day were flowing through the strait. The gap is somewhere between 14 and 16 million barrels per day that simply cannot be rerouted. There is no pipe, there is no road, there is no alternative. Saudi Arabia did restore its crucial east-west pipeline to full capacity this past Sunday after it was damaged in attacks last week. That pipeline runs 200 kilometers across the Arabian Peninsula to the Red Sea. Its restored pumping capacity is approximately 7 million barrels per day. That helps, but it still does not close the gap. And for LNG, the IEA is blunt. There are no alternative routes to supply natural gas from Qatar or the UAE to the global market other than through the strait. What about going around Africa? Ships can reroute via the Cape of Good Hope, but that adds 10 to 15 additional days to transit time between the Persian Gulf and major consuming regions in Asia and Europe. That is not just inconvenient. It means every shipping contract, every insurance policy, every delivery schedule in the global economy has to be renegotiated. Freight rates explode, insurance premiums explode, and those costs land on the final consumer, you. Now let's talk about what actually happened in Islamabad, because the official narrative from both sides leaves out the most important details. The trilateral talks, organized by Pakistan, were described as the most significant direct U.S.-Iran engagement in decades. Their stated goal was to stabilize a fragile ceasefire that had taken hold the previous week after a month of fighting that rattled global markets and sent oil prices soaring. The ceasefire had one central condition: Iran would reopen the strait. It did not happen. By April 9th, the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company CEO, Sultan Al Jaber, publicly confirmed that the strait was still not open, with Iran restricting and conditioning traffic. He noted that 230 loaded oil tankers were sitting trapped inside the Gulf, unable to move. So when the American and Iranian delegations sat down in Islamabad, the supposed ceasefire was already broken. The American position going into the talks was simple and non-negotiable. Iran must commit to never seeking a nuclear weapon, not now, not in 2 years, and not in 10. Vance said after the talks that the United States could not see a fundamental commitment by the Iranians to forego nuclear weapons in the long term. Iran, for its part, refused to give up its stockpile of highly enriched uranium. But here is what most coverage missed entirely. Iran's negotiating demands were not just about nuclear technology. According to sources briefed on the talks, Iran's demands included the release of $6 billion in frozen assets, guarantees around its nuclear program, and the right to charge ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran wanted to turn an international waterway, one guaranteed free passage under international law, into a commercial toll road, its own toll road. Vance himself said that Iran's demand to control the Strait of Hormuz added significant complexity to the talks. Both sides entered the room with fundamentally incompatible starting positions. The gap was not one of wording or nuance. It was structural. And this is where a former U.S. State Department negotiator named Aaron David Miller made the most honest observation anyone offered after the collapse. He said that Iran holds more cards than the Americans, that the Iranians are clearly not in a hurry to make concessions, and that they are working on a longer time horizon than Washington. Iran has highly enriched uranium. It has proven that it can use geography as a weapon, and the regime has survived. Those are all leverage points. Iranian Deputy Parliament Speaker Ali Niqzad put it more bluntly from Tehran. He said that in 40 days of war, the United States had learned that the victorious side is determined by the will of nations and superiority on the battlefield, not by rhetoric on social media. An Iranian parliament member, Mahmoud Nabavian, who was part of the negotiating team, told world leaders that the Strait of Hormuz will not open and that the world will come to know a new form of governance over the Strait of Hormuz. A new form of governance. Sit with that phrase for a moment. Now let's get to the most paradoxical element of this entire crisis, the part that almost nobody is discussing clearly. Donald Trump has just announced a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, but the Strait of Hormuz is already blockaded by Iran. So what Trump has actually announced is a blockade of a blockade. Iran has used 4 distinct methods to shut the strait down since February 28th. Physical attacks from boats, missiles, and drones. The laying of sea mines, which create an invisible and persistent threat. Satellite spoofing and GPS jamming that makes navigation nearly impossible. And economic intimidation, forcing insurance costs so high that most ship owners simply will not take the risk. By the time the ceasefire was declared, Iran had carried out 21 confirmed attacks on merchant vessels. Since the start of the war, at least 22 ships have been attacked in the strait, 10 crew members have been killed, an estimated 800 commercial vessels have become stranded, and around 20,000 seafarers cannot transit the area safely. And then there is the mine problem. This is perhaps the most extraordinary detail of the entire crisis. Reports indicate that Iran itself has lost control of some of the mines it laid in the strait, meaning that even if Iran wanted to fully reopen the passage, it cannot do so unilaterally. The weapon it used to shut the world's most critical waterway is now beyond its own ability to completely manage. This is why the U.S. Navy was already moving even before the Islamabad talks concluded. 2 American guided missile destroyers, USS Frank E. Peterson and USS Michael Murphy, passed through the strait on Saturday as part of a mine-clearing mission, the first transit of American warships through the strait since the war began 6 weeks ago. Trump confirmed the U.S. would begin destroying the mines the Iranians laid in the straits. But here is the geopolitical trap. Chinese, Indian, and Pakistani ships have been among the few vessels still transiting the strait, doing so under separate arrangements with Tehran. Iran has been forcing tankers to transit through passages controlled by its military and charging them millions of dollars in toll fees. NBC News reported this in detail. Trump has now instructed the Navy to seek and interdict every vessel in international waters that has paid a toll to Iran. He said, "No one who pays an illegal toll will have safe passage on the high seas." Think about what that means in practice. China receives over 37% of all oil exports that pass through the Strait of Hormuz. If American warships begin stopping and boarding Chinese tankers in international waters, The United States will be on a direct collision course with the world's second largest economy and its largest creditor. The same applies to India. Senator Mark Warner of Virginia captured the circular logic perfectly when he asked on CNN, "I don't understand how blockading the strait is going to somehow push the Iranians into opening it. I don't get the connection there." Now, what does all of this mean in numbers that connect to your daily life? The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas built a model specifically for this crisis. Their conclusion? A closure of the Strait of Hormuz that removes close to 20% of global oil supplies from the market during the second quarter of 2026 is expected to raise the average WTI price of oil to $98 per barrel and lower global real GDP growth by an annualized 2.9 percentage points. If the closure extends to 2 quarters, the price rises to $115 per barrel. 3 quarters, potentially $132. We are already seeing the effects in real time. U.S. gasoline prices have already risen above $4 per gallon, the highest since late 2023. The cost of jet fuel in the United States has surged by 95% since the war began, according to the Argus U.S. Jet Fuel Index. Ryanair CEO Michael O'Leary has predicted summer flight cancellations of 5 to 10% if the strait stays closed. The IEA has described the combined impact as the greatest threat to global energy security in history. And the effects are not limited to wealthy countries. The Philippines declared a national energy emergency in late March because it imports 98% of its oil from the Gulf. Bangladesh is experiencing fuel robberies at gas stations across the country, with station managers being beaten and killed over shortages. In Bangladesh, a nation of 175 million people that relies on imports for roughly 95% of its energy needs, the closure of the strait is not an abstraction. It is a survival crisis. In Africa, fuel and fertilizer prices have shot up across the continent as Iran has effectively shut down the strait. The IEA's largest ever release of emergency oil stocks, 400 million barrels, sounds enormous until you do the math. Global oil consumption runs at approximately 103 million barrels per day. That 400 million barrel release covers less than 4 days of global demand. Even measured against normal Hormuz flows of 20 million barrels per day, it equates to about 20 days of the strait's usual throughput. Strategic reserves are a tourniquet, not a cure. Now let's zoom out and look at where we have seen this before, because history does not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes with disturbing precision. The Dallas Fed identified the historical precedents directly. Major oil supply shortfalls driven by geopolitical events previously occurred following the Yom Kippur War in 1973, the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the outbreak of the Iran-Iraq War in 1980, and the Persian Gulf War in 1990. Each of those events caused inflation shocks that outlasted the immediate crisis by years. The oil embargo of 1973 did not just raise prices temporarily. It restructured the entire Western economic order, created the stagflation decade, and forced a complete rethinking of energy policy. But what makes the 2026 crisis categorically different from all of those historical precedents is a single factor: the mines. In 1973, OPEC simply turned off a tap. In 1979, a revolution disrupted Iranian production. In each case, the disruption was reversible relatively quickly once the political situation shifted. Today, Iran has physically altered the strait itself. Mines do not disappear when a ceasefire is declared. They sit on the seabed, invisible, until they are found and removed one by one. That is why the IEA's executive director used the phrase, "greatest threat to global energy security in history." This is not a temporary supply interruption. It is a structural disruption to the world's most critical energy corridor, and here is the shadow economy dimension that the mainstream coverage consistently ignores. While American and Iranian diplomats were failing to reach an agreement in Islamabad, Chinese tankers were quietly completing deals with Tehran and moving oil through whatever passage Iran permitted. Tankers loaded with Saudi and Emirati oil, chartered by Unipec, the trading arm of Chinese energy giant Sinopec, were already moving, with arrival times calculated weeks ahead. The geopolitical conflict operates on one timeline. The shadow oil trade operates on a completely different one. Iran has learned from decades of sanctions how to monetize a crisis even while the crisis is ongoing. Neither side has indicated what happens on April 22nd, when the 14-day ceasefire expires. Pakistan's foreign minister has urged all parties to maintain it. Iran's foreign ministry has said that diplomacy never comes to an end, while simultaneously, its state media reports no plans for another round of negotiations. The U.S. has called Iran's last offer its final and best. Trump has said the military is locked and loaded and ready to finish up the little that is left of Iran. Two navies, one 34-kilometer corridor, 230 loaded oil tankers trapped inside the Gulf, 20,000 seafarers who cannot move safely, a mine-infested seabed that no one fully controls, a 14-day ceasefire about to expire, and no agreement. The IEA's executive director has said the combined impacts of this crisis amount to the greatest threat to global energy security in history. Not one of the greatest. The greatest. So here is the question I want to leave you with today. Not a political question, not a question about Trump or Iran or ceasefire timelines, a personal question. The Dallas Fed's model shows that even in the best-case scenario, where the strait reopens after one quarter, the global economy does not recover its growth trajectory until late in the year. The historical precedents suggest that inflationary pressure from an energy shock of this magnitude does not vanish when the physical crisis ends. It lingers in supply chains, in food prices, in energy costs, for months and sometimes years afterward. So the question is this: if the people making decisions in Washington and Tehran could not reach an agreement after 21 hours in the same room, if a waterway that carries 20% of the world's oil supply is sitting behind a field of mines that nobody fully controls, and if every model and every historical parallel suggests that the economic consequences of a prolonged disruption will reach into your grocery bill, your fuel tank, and your heating costs, regardless of where you live, what have you personally done to prepare for a world where the next shock arrives before this one is resolved? Because history does not wait for press conferences, and the next crisis does not schedule itself around your readiness.